The thing that unsettled Meredith Voss first was not the darkness, not the cold, and not even the sounds that came from the wrong direction at the wrong hour. What unsettled her first was that Darren kept blinking at the exact same interval, every 4 seconds, without variation, for 11 minutes. She would not understand what that meant until the second night. Meredith had been leading backcountry expeditions in the southern Appalachians since 2009. Not guided tours, real wilderness navigation, permit-only backcountry, the kind of terrain that the National Park Service marks with a single asterisk on their difficulty scale and a footnote that reads, "Experienced hikers only." She had logged more than 4,000 trail miles across 14 states. She had evacuated 2 hikers with hypothermia near Roan Mountain in January of 2017, and once guided a group through a whiteout on the Franconia Ridge that had turned 3 other parties back. She was not a person who startled easily, and she was not a person who ignored her instincts. On the morning of October 14th, 2022, she met Darren Schauf and Polly Achterberg at the Springer Mountain Trailhead in Fannin County, Georgia, at 6:48 in the morning. The sky was the flat gray of old pewter. They had connected through a long-distance hiking forum 6 weeks earlier, cross-referencing trip reports and permit windows until they found a 10-day window that worked for all 3 of them. Meredith had vetted them carefully. Polly was a pediatric occupational therapist from Asheville who had completed the Long Trail solo in 2019. Darren was a structural engineer from Knoxville with a rack of gear that told the story of someone who had spent real time outdoors. Not new, not showroom, worn in the right places, patched where it mattered. They signed the register at 7:02. Meredith wrote their names in her own handwriting, which she always did when leading a group. A habit from her early guiding days, when her first mentor, a woman named Ruth Ann Price, who had thru-hiked the AT 4 times before losing 2 toes to frostbite, told her, "Always be the one who writes the names. Own the group. Know who you're responsible for." The first 3 days were clean. Good weather, low humidity, the kind of October light in North Georgia that falls through yellow hickory leaves and turns the trail gold. Polly was steady and quiet. She carried a custom frame pack stitched by a woman in Vermont and moved with the economical rhythm of someone who had learned that speed is a debt you pay later. Darren was talkative in the mornings, mostly about load-bearing calculations and the tensile properties of different rope materials, which Meredith found tedious but harmless. He cooked well, sharing an embarrassing amount of spices for a backcountry trip, and he was generous with his fuel canister when Meredith's valve ran slow on the second morning. The first anomaly came on the evening of the third day at a campsite just south of Gooch Mountain Shelter, roughly 11 miles from the trailhead. They had eaten, the fire was low, they kept small fires, more for comfort than warmth, and they were sitting in the arrangement hikers fall into naturally after dark, the triangle of 3 people around a common light. Polly was writing in a small notebook she carried in her hip belt. Darren was looking at the fire. He was looking at it very steadily. Meredith noticed because she was a noticer. She noticed the way the firelight moved and the shadows it threw on his face, and she noticed that he wasn't blinking at the rate that people blink when they are thinking about nothing, which is the rate that people blink when they look at fire. She started counting. She did not know why she started counting. The interval was precise. 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. Never 3.5, never 5. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that she was tired, and that when people are tired, they notice patterns that aren't significant. She told herself that blinking rates varied by individual, and that nothing about an even interval was inherently strange. She believed herself. She went to sleep. On the morning of the 4th day, the trail climbed sharply north of Gooch toward Woody Gap, and the conversation between the 3 of them took on the quality that long-distance hiking conversations always eventually take. Disconnected, associative, the kind of talking that happens when the body is working hard and the mind is simultaneously very present and very far away. Polly talked about a patient she'd had, a 7-year-old boy with sensory processing difficulties, who had made a breakthrough after 18 months of therapy. And there was something raw and careful in the way she talked about it that told Meredith this boy was still on her mind in the way that certain patients stay. Darren listened. He said the right things. He said them at the right times. He asked the right follow-up question. That was the second anomaly, though Meredith would not name it as such until later. The follow-up question was, what was the first thing he said to you when you realized he'd made the breakthrough? It was a good question, a genuinely perceptive question, the kind that shows you've been paying attention and that you understand something about what the other person is trying to say. Polly smiled and answered it, and the conversation moved on, and nothing about the exchange was wrong in any identifiable way. But Meredith had the brief, irrational sensation that the question had been calculated. Not in the way that manipulative people calculate their words. She had encountered enough of those in her guiding career and knew that particular texture. This was different. This felt like the question had been generated from the outside of the conversation, rather than from within it, as though something had listened to the conversation and then produced the most contextually appropriate response. She put the thought away. She was tired, and she was overthinking. That night, they camped near Blood Mountain at 4,458 feet, the highest point on the Appalachian Trail in Georgia. And the wind came up after 11, and the temperature dropped faster than the forecast had suggested. Meredith woke at 2:17. She knew the time because she had a habit of checking her watch when she woke in the backcountry, a reflex from years of permit window compliance. And she lay in her sleeping bag and listened to the wind and the creak of the trees. What she heard under the wind was a sound she could not immediately place. It was not a sound that belonged to wind or trees or animals. It was regular in a way that natural sounds are not regular. It was rhythmic in the way that a mechanical system is rhythmic, not in the way that a heartbeat or a breath is rhythmic, because heartbeats and breaths have variance, however small, and this sound did not. It was coming from the direction of Darren's tent. She told herself it was his breathing. She told herself that some people breathe with unusual regularity when they are deep asleep. She listened for 3 more minutes and the sound continued, even, metronomic, and then she covered her ears with the hood of her sleeping bag and forced herself to stop listening. On the 5th day, they crossed into Union County, and the trail changed character in the way it does when you move deeper into the southern Appalachians. The air thicker, more vegetative, the undergrowth pressing in closer on both sides, the light arriving filtered and green even on clear days. They had agreed to push for Trey Mountain on day 5, a longer mileage day with significant elevation change, and the conversation between the 3 of them thinned as they focused on moving. Meredith was leading, Polly in the middle, Darren at the back. At some point in the early afternoon, she looked back to check the group spacing. Another habit, automatic, she did it without thinking. And she saw Polly walking with her head slightly tilted to the left, listening to something. Meredith stopped and waited for them to catch up, and she asked Polly if she was okay. And Polly said yes, she was fine. She just thought she'd heard something off the trail. What kind of something? Meredith asked. Polly looked briefly uncomfortable. Like someone talking, she said, or, I don't know, like someone repeating something. Meredith looked past Polly to Darren, who was standing at his natural spacing behind her, his expression neutral, his breathing even. Repeating what? Meredith asked. Polly shook her head. I couldn't make it out. It sounded like it had a pattern, but I couldn't. She stopped. It's nothing. I'm tired. Let's keep moving. They kept moving. That night, at the tent site below Trey Mountain, Polly came and sat beside Meredith while Darren went to filter water from the creek, and she said something that Meredith would think about for the rest of the trip and for a long time afterward. Does he seem different to you? Polly asked. Meredith did not ask who. In what way? Polly was quiet for a moment. The creek made its sound in the darkness below them, and the sound of Darren's filter pump was regular and clear. He asks questions the way someone does when they've read about how to ask questions, Polly said slowly. Not like he's actually curious, like he's running a protocol. Meredith said nothing. I know that sounds crazy, Polly said. It doesn't, Meredith said. They looked at each other for a moment, and then they looked away, because what they had almost said out loud was something that neither of them was ready to say yet. On the 6th day, Darren made breakfast. He made it the way he had made it every morning, competently, efficiently, with the same measured movements. He passed Meredith her coffee the way he always did, using her preferred grip, though she had not told him her preferred grip. She thought about that for a long time before she acknowledged what it meant. She had not told him. She had simply reached for the cup the first morning in the way that she always did, and he had observed it. And he had not simply remembered it, anyone might remember it, but he had replicated it with a precision that made the act feel less like consideration and more like mimicry. Like he had not remembered her preference, but had modeled it. Had run a small calculation each morning, the angle of the handle, the distance from the fire, the speed at which she preferred the handoff. She drank her coffee and watched him pack his bag and did not let her face show anything. That day, she began to watch him systematically. She watched the way he walked. His footfall was even, precise, and she realized as she watched it over the course of miles, he never adjusted his stride. Hikers adjust constantly. They shift weight, they compensate for fatigue, they favor a foot when a hot spot develops, they change their rhythm on switchbacks. Darren's stride did not change. His cadence over flat ground and his cadence on the climb were in the same exact proportion to one another, hour after hour, with no evidence of fatigue. She watched the way he ate. He chewed at the same rate, regardless of what he was eating. He did not react differently to hot food than to room temperature food, did not make the small involuntary sounds that people make when something is particularly good or particularly bland. She watched the way he talked. He was fluent, contextually appropriate, responsive. He completed every sentence. He never lost his train of thought. He never reached for a word. He never laughed before the funny part of the sentence arrived. That last detail took her the longest to isolate, but once she saw it, she could not unsee it. When Polly said something funny, and Polly was quietly, observationally funny, the kind of humor that builds, he laughed at the precise moment the funny part landed. Not a fraction of a second before, which is what people do when they anticipate the rhythm of a joke because they're engaged with the person telling it. Not a fraction of a second after, which is what people do when they take a moment to process. At the exact moment, like something calculating the optimal response time. On the seventh night, Meredith lay awake and made a decision. She waited until she was certain Darren was in his tent. She waited another 40 minutes, which she counted on her watch. Then she got up and went to Polly's tent and put her hand on the zipper, careful, and tapped once with a single finger. Polly was awake. She unzipped immediately, which told Meredith that she had not been sleeping either. They sat outside Polly's tent in the cold, close together, speaking very quietly. And Meredith said what they had both been not saying for 3 days. "I don't think we should split up," Meredith said. "Not for any reason. Not for water, not for the privy, not for anything. We stay together." Polly's face in the darkness was very still. "You've decided," she said. "Yes." "What do you think it is?" Meredith shook her head. "He has Darren's gear," Polly said. "He has Darren's voice. He has all of his..." She stopped. "But he doesn't have the things you can't observe, right? He doesn't have the things that aren't on the outside." Meredith thought about the blinking. 4 seconds, exactly, for 11 minutes, without variation. "The original AT register," Meredith said. "At Springer. I wrote the names." Polly understood immediately. "When did it start?" "I don't know." "The first day?" "I don't know." They sat with that. In the morning, Darren was already up when they emerged from their tents. He was standing at the edge of the campsite with his back to them, looking north, and the posture was entirely natural, a person looking at the trail ahead, orienting toward the day. Meredith watched him for a moment before he turned, and she noticed that when he turned, it was smooth. No stiffness, no wince or adjustment. He had been standing motionless, she realized. Not shifting his weight, not repositioning, not doing any of the small things that people do when they stand in one place for more than a minute. "Good morning," he said. His voice was warm, measured. "Morning," Meredith said. He made coffee. He handed it to her at the correct angle. They broke camp at 7:15 and moved north through the Nantahala National Forest. And over the course of the morning, Meredith noticed 3 things that she had not noticed before, now that she was watching differently. The first was that shadows moved across Darren's face the way shadows should move across a face. But the face beneath the shadows did not change in the way that a face changes when light shifts. There were no micro-expressions. There were no involuntary adjustments of the musculature around the eyes when a burst of brightness came through the canopy. The face received the light and was affected by it optically, but not physiologically. The second was that he never looked behind him. Most hikers, even experienced ones, look back periodically. At the view, at their companions, at the trail they've covered. It's an instinctive orientation check. In 8 days of hiking, Meredith had not once seen Darren look behind him, unless he was turning to address one of them directly. The third was the smell. She noticed it on a long, flat section through a hemlock grove south of Waya Bald, where the trail narrowed and they were moving close together. It was not a bad smell. It was not the smell of decay or rot. It was the smell of something with no smell at all. A localized absence of the organic compound that humans and animals and even trees emit. A pocket of olfactory null around him in the midst of the rich, damp, fungal smell of the hemlock forest. Not the absence of sweat or body odor, though that was there too. The absence of any mammalian biological signature. Polly caught Meredith's eye on the trail, and Meredith knew that she had noticed it too. On the 9th day, one day before they were scheduled to exit at the NOC, the Nantahala Outdoor Center at the river crossing in Swain County, they stopped for lunch on a rock shelf above a tributary of the Nantahala River, and it was the first time in 4 days that all three of them were seated together in a relaxed way. And it was the first time in 4 days that the conversation had the quality of early trip conversation. Darren told a story about a bridge inspection he had done in 2018 on a century-old railroad overpass in eastern Tennessee. He was specific. He cited the load-bearing calculations, the soil composition of the embankment, the behavior of the steel under thermal cycling. The story was good. It was interesting. It had the shape of experience. Meredith listened and watched his face and thought, where is the real Darren Schaff? She thought about the register at Springer Mountain and the careful letters in her own handwriting in the morning of October 14th at 7:02 when she had stood at the trailhead with two people she had met on the internet. And she thought about how thoroughly you cannot know someone from a forum, from a trip report, from 6 weeks of message exchanges about permit windows and gear weights. She thought about how easy it would be to miss a substitution if the substitution were good enough. She thought about the things that Polly had said. It doesn't have the things you can't observe. She thought, what if it learned all the observable things well enough that it didn't need the others? What if the observable things were almost everything? What if there was almost nothing left that you couldn't observe? On the 10th day, they exited at the NOC at 1:47 in the afternoon. The parking lot was half full. There were day hikers, families, kayakers pulling boats out of the river. Meredith signed them out on the exit register at the outfitter's desk with the same careful handwriting she always used. Darren shook her hand. His grip was warm, calibrated, appropriately firm. He said it had been a great trip. He said he hoped they could do it again. He loaded his pack into a silver Tacoma with Tennessee plates and drove north on US 19. Meredith stood in the parking lot and watched the truck until it disappeared around the bend. She never contacted him afterward. She did not respond to the message he sent 2 weeks later on the hiking forum, asking if she'd gotten home safe and mentioning a spring trip to the Smokies. She did contact the real Darren Schaff. It took her 3 weeks to find him. The profile on the forum was thin. Most long-distance hikers don't have elaborate online footprints. But she found a structural engineering firm in Knoxville with a Darren Schaff listed as a senior engineer, and she called the main line and she asked if she could speak to him. And the woman who answered put her on hold and then said, after a pause that was slightly too long, Mr. Schaff has been on leave since early October. I'm not sure when he'll be returning. Can I take a message? Meredith left her name and her number. Darren Schaff never called her back. She still thinks about what it was waiting for. She thinks about the 11 minutes of even blinking on the third night. She thinks about the metronomic sound from the tent, the absence of smell in the hemlock grove, the laughter that landed at the precise moment and never a fraction before. She thinks about the 10 days that it walked north with them through the mountains and ate their food and asked their questions back at them. Always the right question, always the right time. She thinks about what it was learning. She thinks about where it went. She has not returned to the Appalachian Trail. She has not been able to explain this in any terms that satisfy her, and she has stopped trying. There is a specific quality to the things that cannot be explained, and that quality is not terror exactly. Terror is an acute response, and this is not acute. It is chronic. It lives in the texture of ordinary things, in a handshake that is calibrated, in a follow-up question that is too good, in the 4-second interval, perfectly even, that your companion keeps blinking at while looking at the fire. If something felt wrong to you on a trail, if something looked right and sounded right and moved right but still felt wrong, Trust that feeling without needing to name what you felt it about. And if you've ever noticed something you couldn't explain out there, hit that like button and subscribe. You're not the only one.